Economic Commission for Africa, and the moderator for this afternoon interesting session on sustainable budgeting approach to climate finance. We're delighted to have a great lineup of distinguished panelists that are participating with us today. I'm going to introduce one by one and ask them to come to the stage once they hear their name. We have His Excellency, Mr. Alcendo Mota, Secretary of State for Finance, Republic of Cabo Verde. Can please. We have also His Excellency, Mr. Amos Lugulubu, Minister of Finance of Uganda. Please have a seat. His Excellency, Mr. Dennis Vandi, Minister of Finance of Sierra Leone. If you can please join us on the stage. His Excellency, Yuker Kanachu, Treasury Secretary of Kenya. If I can ask you to please come and join us on the stage. Mr. Pascal Sant-Amans, Director for the Center for Tax Policy at OECD, please join us. Mr. Brian Callaghan, Lead Researcher at University of Oxford. And Mr. Pekka Morin, Special Representative of Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. Thank you. I understand we will be joined online by Mr. Stephen Stone, Deputy Director of the Economy Division at UNEP. Okay. I think today the topic of this session couldn't be more timely because we are really discussing this issue of a sustainable budgeting approach at a time when we have shrinking resources available to policymakers and increasingly so while they are being faced with series of multiple shocks at global level from the COVID pandemic to the implication of the war in Ukraine, as well as the fallouts of the climate change. So the challenges are really huge and increasing, and the sustainable budgeting framework really allows for tools that can help making sure that the spending are the most efficient and highest returns. And it's really a way to also take into account long-term consideration, including, of course, sustainability and environmental aspects. The sustainability budgeting approach could provide a systemic approach also for comparing policy options to others, and can be a key tool for governments to adapt to better tax planning processes. As you know well by now, all these series of shocks and crises that the continent has faced has resulted in diminishing the fiscal space, but also increasing debt pressures. Now we have 40% of African countries that are in or at high risk of debt distress. We also have global high inflation that is persisting, food prices affecting most vulnerable, and increasing also social pressures on all governments. As a result, you know, really improving the budgeting process and the efficiency of allocation of spending becomes ever more important in that context. And in this session, we will try to explore how countries can really determine and weigh their trade-offs and how to systematically plan budgets to meet development as well as climate challenges. So that's what we really are aiming to achieve through this session and discussion today. And we're very fortunate to have a really distinguished lineup of panelists with us today that we will benefit from their insight and discussion. So I'd like to start with you know, the ministers we have on stage to perhaps give us, from their perspective, policy-making perspective, what they see as the greatest challenges in the budgeting process and the type of barriers making it difficult to really align climate priorities with budgets, as well as where do they see the opportunities. So perhaps if I can start with the Honorable Minister from Cabo Verde to give us his view on these issues.
Thank you. First of all, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to address some remarks to this remarkable audience. As a small island developing state, Cape Verde has to implement its budgets, keeping in mind its extreme vulnerability to external shocks and climate variability. The source of revenue for our budgets are directly associated with our mine industry, that of tourism, and this was severely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis. As a consequence, we have seen our debt level rise. As Cape Verde is a middle income country, we also do not have access to the same low cost of capital as before. We are planning several innovations to improve our budgetary process and also to improve our access to finance. Cape Verde has a strong track record of transparency and good governance in terms of our budget implementation. We want to build to this trust, which has been built up with the population and with partners. We have aimed to diversify our economy by developing the blue sector, seeking to earn more of our oceanic resource in a sustainable manner, accelerating the energy transition, promoting sustainable tourism, environmental sustainability and green growth. By using a sustainable budgeting approach, we hope to show more clearly the link between our natural resource and the opportunity to generate wealth in the country. Indeed, one of the national sustainable development strategic priorities for Cape Verde is by 2030 to minimize all impacts of climate change through multiple level action, developing all necessary capabilities to harness the opportunities provided by the climate change investment to become more sustainable, innovative and resilient. Cape Verde is also in a discussion with its main creditors to explore the options for a debt for a climate adaptation swap. If you are successful in this objective, we will make commitments through our national budgets to invest in climate resilient sectors. If you can adopt sustainable budgeting approach, we can help countries to have better access to financing innovations such as debt swap. We need to build a capacity of countries to be able to access climate financing tools, and the sustainable budgeting approach can help us to this. Our sincere gratitude to the government of Egypt for hosting this important forum, donating National Economic Commission for Africa for co-convening the event, and all participants and panelists for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've heard very interesting issues that you've raised, including the issues of how the current environment have meant pressures for you for debt, higher debt, and how the status of being a middle-income country limits really the options that are available, and also about your efforts now to look into debt for nature swaps, which is a very interesting, actually, innovative financing tool. Thank you very much. If we can perhaps hear from the Honorable Minister of Uganda about what are the key challenges that you face in the budgeting process, and where you see really the opportunities there. Thank you.
Could you repeat? I had been interrupted.
Sure. So the questions that we are posing for all ministers from a policy-making perspectives are: what are the greatest challenges in the budgeting process that you face? And what are the barriers that make it difficult to integrate and align climate issues in budgets? And where do you see the opportunities?
Oh, thank you so much. First, in dealing with the problem of climate change, we have developed a framework for addressing the challenges. We have formulated a national vision that is climate sensitive. And based on this long-term vision of 30 years, we develop medium-term planning frameworks of 5 years. And this program, in these national development plans, we have about 20 programs. And one of such programs is climate change. In that program, various interventions relating to how to address climate change have been identified against given objectives. Now, the budgeting that we do annually is based on what is contained in the National Development Plan. Although we have climate change as one of the programs, we note that climate change is cutting across various other programs. So we mainstream climate change in all these programs. Now, the challenge, of course, is going to come from the provision of adequate resources to climate change, because over the years, climate resources have been heavily degraded to the extent that you need enormous amount of resources first to restore them and to reduce on the extent to which they continue to be depleted. So enormous resources are required in that particular area. At the same time, you have so many other national requirements that you need to address. At the same time, you note that our tax to GDP ratio is still very low. At 13% is lower than the sub-Saharan average, meaning that the amount of resources you have at your disposal to address climate challenges are very limited. You have money largely to help you service your debts for interest payments, and therefore leaving very limited resources to address climate-related issues. So that is really the number one problem. And the coming in of COVID-19 pandemic with its impacts meant that to address that challenge, at a time when nobody was willing to provide any concessional loans, we had to borrow quite heavily from the open market, and that borrowing has meant that our debt portfolio has gone up, therefore worsening the debt burden. And this is where we are now facing challenges where we need the support of various donors with concessional lending. Blended climate financing is extremely needed to address the current challenges we have. As government, we have decided, even with the little resources that we have, that the people who encroached on wetlands, for example, because we have a number of wetlands, water bodies which have been encroached upon, those have to be removed regardless of the social implications, because in invading those wetlands are protected by law. So they have to go without any form of compensation because they invaded these resources. So largely, those are the challenges of restoring the resources, but also availing resources to invest more in these mitigation and adaptation measures that are required in climate change. In general, that is the biggest problem that we have, but of course, we are now planning, we are in the process of creating a climate financing unit within the Ministry of Finance, and we've been working with the GGGI to make sure that this is set up and to build the necessary capacities to be able to understand more on issues relating to climate financing, which we have been going through, and how to access climate financing, because we think that this is going to be very critical in terms of restoring our resources. So fortunately, we have the framework for budgeting, and what is largely lacking are the resources and the mobilization of the population to appreciate the importance of climate change.
Thank you very much. I think, I mean, you raised very, interesting point, particularly on issues of national vision and kind of having the medium-term perspective and, integrating issues of climate and nature within the budget. Thank you for this. We'll come later with follow-up also to learn from that experience. I'd like to hear on these issues from the Honorable Minister of Sierra Leone to get your perspective on the challenges and key barriers to integrating climate within the budget and opportunities that you see.
Thank you very much. I think my brother here has highlighted most of the issues because we in Africa face similar issues. But from the budgeting perspective, I want to say that for least developed countries, Because when it comes to Africa, it can be divided into 3 areas. The least developing, the medium, and the higher one like Egypt we're seeing. So we are challenged with social issues. How do we ensure we transform those issues into budgeting, and particularly in relation to sustainable budgeting? What we in Sierra Leone are doing as a government, we have developed a whole Ministry of Environment, and we have reviewed a lot of laws around environmental protection. If you know Sierra Leone, we have heavy mining activities in Sierra Leone, and for years, for decades, most of these mining companies have been exploiting. So there are new regulations, new mining laws have been enacted to protect the environment. So on a budgeting perspective, we do yearly budgets, and to do yearly budget with almost 76% debt to GDP ratio is challenging. So, but notwithstanding, we've managed to squeeze a lot of money into those activities in protecting the environment. But because of the lack of resources, as highlighted by my brother here, it's been a serious challenge. My position is that with less than 4% emission and 17% of the world's population, we are suffering a lot in Africa. So I am calling for maybe a support from developed multinationals and bilateral partners to see how we can support Africa, particularly least developed countries, in addressing budgeting issues more relating to adaptation. Because of the economic hardship, you see a lot of people moving from the rural areas to the urban areas. And when they come to these urban areas, most of them try to damage the environment. Like, because even housing, they would try to cut trees that they're not supposed to stay in certain areas. And you see, in 2019, we had a serious mudslide that killed over 400 people. Even as of 2 weeks ago, we had a mudslide again that killed about 10 people. People continue to live in those areas, but how do you move these people away from those for survival when you don't have the resources to take care of them? So when it comes to budgeting, we will do our best, but there are limitations. So my call is that with the COP27, we're looking for more financing support, how we can address a lot of climate change issues. Because when it comes to accessing these funds, I think I'm happy that we have a sustainable budget approach that can be adapted in most African countries. Because I don't hope that there will be flexibility in the budgeting approach, because the budgeting approach for Egypt might be different for Sierra Leone in terms of how we assess it. The economic values on the climate change values can be the same, but when it comes to the economic values, there should be some variables. I'm expecting some variables in those approach. So it's a big challenge, and I do hope that by the end of COP27 we can see more integration, how we can support most of the challenges faced by Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we heard about from you about the issues of lack of resources and how this is becoming an increasing pressure, but also your call for support for adaptation and support of international community on the financing side, taking into account country specificity. Thank you. We'd like to hear from the Honorable Minister, Treasury Secretary of Kenya, your views and country experience in that area.
Thank you very much. I am representing my minister. My name is Dr. Julius Moya. I'm the Permanent Secretary for Treasury. And so this area of budgeting and climate finance is really very appropriate for us. And if I can start from the high level, is to appreciate that climate change is a very cross-cutting issue. And when we are looking at budgeting at a national level, one has to appreciate that then, so that we budget for climate issues, climate change properly, then in all the sectors, we must be able to appreciate the impact and how climate is related to every sector that we are budgeting for. So in a way, that is a challenge, but in a way, there's an opportunity because we need to address the mindset change so that people appreciate the role of climate change in all the sectors. Now, the second item that I would like to comment on is how we are organized in Kenya. We have a climate finance unit under the National Treasury, which deals with the finance aspect of climate change. And then we have got the sector aspect in terms of action on climate change under Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And so in a way, that gives us an opportunity so that the budgeting side, National Treasury and Ministry of Finance drives that agenda. But then again, in terms of action, that is domiciled under the Ministry of Environment, which then helps coordinate all the nationally determined contributions and actions thereof. So that makes it easier and also complicated for us to be able to harness all those actions and budget correctly. There's also the question about greening the budgeting process, because the way the budgeting process is set is that it follows the public finance management framework, which is not yet green, if I can use that terminology. And so I think there's a challenge in terms of us looking for ways in which we can introduce nomenclature in our public finance management. And therefore, this would also give us an opportunity so that we can move to what I would say standardization of how you do budget coding. Because when you look at the current budget coding that we have, it lacks various aspects of climate change that needs to be introduced in the budget coding. And that is where I think the countries that are ahead of us in that area, and also the Bretton Woods institutions can also help us, including UNECA, so that we adopt a standard chart of accounts which recognizes the role of climate change, both on the side of revenue raising. If you look at the budget process, there's the revenue side and also the expenditure side, both in terms of capital expenditure for development and recurrent expenditure. So if all that is looked at, then we can be able to come up with a standard chart of accounts that can be used across in many countries. Now, the other point that I would like to say is the question of valuation of climate assets and also valuation of climate liabilities. That again is something that we need to address. To me, that's a challenge, so that we have got a uniform way of accounting for climate assets and climate liabilities, so that as we are reporting on them, both in terms of the inputs in the budgeting process, reporting on the outputs in the budgeting process, and also having a credible monitoring and evaluation to track the outcomes, to track the impact, we should be using the same framework. Last and not least, let me say that also just going back to the training institutions to make sure that what is being taught in terms of budgeting is actually alive to what now we are calling budgeting for climate change, so that then we come up with knowledge that captures that area of climate change, both at mitigation level, adaptation level, and also at resilient level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think you've really brought a number of dimensions to the discussion here, including the issue of taking into account across sector dimensions and the role of coordination across different governmental bodies, as well as need to greening budget process and standardization, and as well as monitoring of the process. Thank you. If we can perhaps move to our panelists to give us a bit of different perspectives. So if we can start by OECD, Pascal here, and if you can give us your insights about how the sustainable budgeting approach fits into a green budgeting framework led by OECD, and more generally into tax policy formulation and administration.
Thank you,
Please.
Madam Chair. Good afternoon to you all, and thanks for the previous speakers for the very, very good remarks. And I should say thanks to Egypt to have invited us, the OECD, to speak to this very important conference. I would like to make two main points there from an OECD perspective. The OECD is a group of 38 countries which are quite advanced economically, and therefore it can be too easy for us to say what rules should be when in the climate field precisely you have such inequalities. Countries which have developed polluting the earth for 200 years and now are realizing that we're in danger and telling all the others which have not yet developed, oh yeah, you should be careful on what you do. So I'm aware of this bias before speaking. So the first thing which our colleague from Kenya has just indicated, which I think is absolutely key and costless, is to do green budgeting. I mean, green budgeting means that within your budget process, annual, pluriannual process, you have a mechanism to track the expenditure and possibly the tax incentive to what is environment friendly and what is not environment friendly. And it's not only, an annex to the budget that you can do, but something absolutely core to the budget. Governments are usually very careful about whether they have deficit or not deficits. It's something key in the building of the budget. Well, the net positive or net negative impact of a budget on the environment is something which can be very helpful, at least in terms of awareness of the decision. And we have at the OECD developed some of green budgeting rules, happy to share, happy to provide assistance, or more importantly, to brainstorm with you on checking how we can improve that. But it's something cheap, which can make a difference, and I was very glad to hear the experience of Kenya, which I think is very important. At the OECD, I'm the tax guy, so I feel obliged to talk about tax, but when we talk about budgeting, there is, the resource, the revenue, and it's about budgeting. And on tax, I would say it's complex and goes in opposite direction. You have one direction, which is about putting a price on carbon. And I think it is the concern today primarily of advanced economies, which recognize that a price of 90 euros per ton of carbon should be imposed on carbon, so that relative prices would be impacted, and that the choice of investment would be directed by the impact on environment of carbon emissions. So putting a price tag on carbon emissions seems something absolutely key. Now again, I understand that it's easy to say when you are from an OECD country, and much more difficult when you are not from an OECD country, especially as the OECD, the G20, the big countries have been very keen on telling developing countries don't do fossil fuel subsidies. It's really bad. And I think economically it's bad. It's a no-brainer. It's bad. It's fascinating, however, to see that when you have an energy price hike, as is the case following what's happening currently, well, the first thing that all these rich countries which have told you don't do that is to do it, and to do massive fossil fuel subsidies, where we see that the political economy of the reform is extremely difficult, and that's what we should collectively be working on. So putting a price on carbon is something which is around, which will have an impact on everyone, which is very difficult, which will take time, and which needs to take into account the non-price-based mitigation policies, because there are other ways, like saying I don't want to have thermic car after 2035. and what would be the equivalent price of that, and maybe some regulatory measures can be taken in developing countries, and we need to assess the situation. We need to sit countries around the table and to have the debate, and that's why the OECD has launched and is establishing now an inclusive forum on carbon mitigation approaches. Carbon mitigation approaches, meaning can be price-based or non-price-based. Inclusive forum means we need everybody around the table, and I would encourage African countries to go there and tell OECD countries and others, you know what, guys, you should do this and that, instead of lecturing the world, if I may a bit counterintuitive there. The other dimension I would like to finish with is about the tax incentives, because you can collect taxes, and I think many countries will need to collect taxes. I heard, I think it's the minister from Uganda who referred to the tax to GDP ratio, 13%, you said. It's too low to ensure development. We don't know what the right ratio is with the UN, but it's probably closer to 20% than 30%. So you are much too low, and bringing more revenue is key. And that's where the tax incentives are double-edged. They can facilitate a transition, but they can also be extremely costly in terms of wasteful tax incentives. And here again, we are trying at the OECD to develop in an inclusive manner tools to understand what happens, to benchmark, to compare. We are at the beginning of a long trip, a long journey. It must be an inclusive journey. There are massive challenges for the whole humanity, for the world, and no easy answer. But budgeting and tax will be core to that debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you brought number of very interesting aspects. I think to me one of the key things that stuck is the idea that we have to be very careful about what is the net positive or negative impact of the budget on environment. I think this is something that needs to be at the core going forward, and as well as the non-price of mitigation price. So this will be key, but perhaps related to this, if I can just follow up, because you've mentioned, for example, for the OECD countries, some of the things that they did is reverse this, but here what we are talking about is a trade-off, is exactly what we are referring to here. They made a trade-off between the social pressures and social safety nets and the long-term impact on the environment. So how does such a process, sustainable budgeting approach can help anchor this huge tension between the short term and the long term? Maybe you can just...
Right now?
Yeah, if you can just give us like a sense of...
I mean, it's a very good question because it doesn't have an answer, and that's where we need to do the hard work in terms of making the analysis. Both in terms of, we were talking about the tax incentive, the fossil fuel subsidies, but also in terms of carbon pricing. So on carbon pricing, you have the social impact, and in countries where you have a large majority of the population which is poor, what do? Is it a fossil fuel in general, a fossil fuel subsidy in general? Are they more targeted? Can you handle the targeted measure to manage the social impact? I mean, what is striking is, I have a team of economists and very good, and they say, well, that must be a price. And then we go to see government and say, you should put a price on carbon. And the next time they lose the election or there are riots in the street. So it's easy to say this is what you should do, but the real question is not whether we should do that or not. Yes, we should do it, but how you get there. And how you get there taking into account the difference of developments, taking into account the needs for financing. So I'm not sure it's one against the other, but how do we put all these different pieces together, analyzing the impact on investment, on growth, and there it's interesting to see that putting a price on carbon actually doesn't have that negative impact on investment, which is counterintuitive, but the social impact is absolutely key and should help policymakers to be more targeted in their measure, to be smarter in their measure. I mean, walking up the stairs with David Bradbury, who's the head of division in my team, he spent the summer on a road trip in France because we're based in Paris, and he was saying, well, France has just done a program of massive fossil fuel subsidy, reducing the price of oil for 30 cents of euros per liter. It's not targeted. He benefited from here. He's a wealthy international civil servant. So how do you design policies for that? That's a good question, and what I'm suggesting is no solution, or actually a solution which is let's all work together on making a detailed analysis and connecting the dots so that we have a good understanding, not only for some types of society, but all the countries altogether.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to move to Bika now. If you could share with us, your thoughts and feedback on the views from the coalition of Ministers of Finance for Climate Action in terms of challenges and opportunities ahead, please.
Thank you very much, and congratulations for our Egyptian hosts for organizing such an important discussions here today, tomorrow, and yesterday. Let me first say that I'm talking here also on behalf of our Indonesian co-chairs who couldn't be there, unfortunately, but we share the thoughts, and I also would like to share the experiences of the coalition from the past 3.5 years that we have been working. We are now 75 countries, 16 countries from Africa. We doubled the African membership the past year, which is excellent, and we have 25 institutional partners supporting us. So it's up and running now. Our goal really is to mainstream climate considerations into economic and financial policy. So it's a very kind of a systemic agenda, big changes, but we need to develop very pragmatic ways on how to do that. We have produced 2 papers that are worth noting now around this topic. One is about understanding the risks of climate change from the perspective of finance ministries. That's came out last year. And more recent one is more like about practices, fiscal practices, and understanding the relevance of the climate perspective in the planning, fiscal planning. I would also like to make the point that we should also be talking more broadly about public financial management as a whole. So thinking about the balance sheet of the government, including the funding and tax revenues, and also procurement practices and investments, asset management, and so forth. So it's a broad agenda, but important one. And I should also say, this is I think important to mention, that it is, when it comes to this topic, it's very early days. So there are, even if there are countries that have actually taken green budgeting into use, it's still very experimental. So there are many sort of obstacles, and this is the same no matter what level of country you are in terms of income, low income, middle income, high income. I think the challenge is shared, and that's where really the coalition can learn from small countries and large countries. And as we heard today from the ministers in Africa, we have many good examples where we have really been learning from African countries. Uganda, Rwanda, for example, have been very active in the coalition, and that's important. But let me share a couple of key challenges. I want to say this really first because we have in the room representatives and even ministers of finance. And I also say this because in Finland the green budgeting actually started because minister ordered civil servants to actually do that. It's still under development, but I think I would like to first address the importance of political mandate. You should ask yourselves, is there a kind of institutionalized or politically approved mandate for finance minister to actually start doing this? Because if there is not, I think there are issues that are not easily fixed. I give you a couple of examples. You need a lot of technical knowledge. You need data, you need tools, modeling tools, you need IT systems, but you can also, start very simple. You can do everything manually. I think in Finland, for example, we are stuck now that we have been doing the budget tagging manually, and we cannot really make progress unless we invest a bit more about the new technology and all that. But still, it's a start, and the other one is governance. It relates to governance because finance ministries are really not key players, and this is a fact, and key challenge. They are not really key actors in the design of climate policy. So they are learning, and they don't have the kind of standing role in the governance structures. So that's also quite relevant factor. And then, of course, the skills and competencies. They are all under sort of development right now. But what can coalition then do? One is, that's why we also gather ministers together twice a year in Washington. Now we can do it in person again, because it's important that ministers face to face around the table actually share their experiences. And this has been raised by the co-chairs, our ministers, really as one of the key elements of the coalition, also in terms of giving reasonings in the home to the government about and parliaments on how to make progress is really this learning from other experiences, because they're very challenging issues when you start reforming your policies. And of course, developing the skills. I'm sitting next to the colleague of the OECD. OECD is an important partner. I think development banks play an important advisory role. So really a lot of the technical work, expertise is in these institutions, and we benefit from that. We try to efficiently cooperate with them and gather the best possible expertise. That's important. And maybe just lastly to say that it's really about really smart making the fiscal economic policy planning smarter. There is no extra new money around. The coalition, for example, doesn't have a big pocket full of money, but they're the kind of that's the reality. Even the opposite, debt levels are high. All countries are struggling with the resources, but we can help each other in making the smart moves and that way help. And if, of course, everything is related to also the government's task to ensure access to finance. Without credible know-how on how to recognize and be aware of the climate risks, you cannot really manage them, and then this will all be reflected in your access to finance in general, be whatever kind of finance we are talking about, market-based, donor finance, and all that. And my last point is that Special Advisor Selvin Hart spoke today about really the urgency of climate action. I fully share that there is urgency, but from the where we come from in the finance ministry, I think the urgency is about getting finance ministries into the picture, making sure that they are well equipped, they have the good quality expertise. We are not talking about big teams, we are talking about a couple of people who know what to do, and this is where the coalition can help. I lastly want to say that if there are countries who are interested to join, who are not yet members, we are happy to explain what we do a bit in more detail today, this evening, and tomorrow here with my team. And also, it's a great progress again for the hosts of Egypt to actually take these aspects more into the international scene and the COP discussions. So I think that's really welcome development. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I think we can all agree on the importance of peer-to-peer learning platforms and mechanisms. Thank you. I would like to actually mention that there is supposed to be a live online survey that is available. If we can have the link to it so that we can invite delegates to in the room to indicate the opportunities and challenges that they would like to hear about it, that would be good. I'd like now to move to Dr. Stephen Stone. If we can, perhaps, I think he's joining us online after we just show the link. Yeah, okay. Hello, hi, Stephen. If we can get your insights in terms of why we need to focus on this issue of budgeting, and in very concrete terms, how can focusing on the budgeting process help in catalyzing finance for countries? Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. And good afternoon to those who are in the conference today. I'd like to thank our Egyptian hosts for organizing the event, and also to the UN Economic Commission of Africa, our very good partners, for inviting UNEP into the conversation today. Of course, the things I have to say probably will not surprise you. I mean, in addition to the shocks that we've heard about today, from the perspective of UNEP, some of the most important shocks are coming from unstable weather, from the climate system itself. And this summer was no exception. We saw historical droughts, fires, and more recently floods. This is affecting every country in the world. And of course, by affecting every country in the world, it affects the ministries of finance, which have to deal with rebuilding the infrastructure or putting in the safety nets to cope with some of the extreme weather events, from the nature loss and from rising pollution and toxicity. So at UNEP, we call this the triple planetary crisis. It's front and center for us. And my point here today is that it's absolutely material for those who are in the ministries of finance, who have to make these budgeting decisions every day, budgeting and borrowing, I would say. Because against the backdrop of the pandemic, what we saw was a nascent recovery in Africa, which has been hit by supply shocks from the Ukraine crisis, the conflict in Ukraine, but also from rising interest rates, raising the borrowing costs for countries, the fiscal pressure that we've heard about, and also make the outlook for global demand even more uncertain. So a lot of risks, a lot of clouds on the horizon, and few choices. And this is precisely why the question of budgeting is important, because while there are many financial instruments out there, and we heard from some of the ministers today talking about possible debt swaps, other ways of leveraging finance from around the world. We know the exceptional 650 billion SDR allocation for the fund last year. And by the way, many countries have availed themselves of the SDR funds, including 30 countries in Africa who I believe have used up to 90% of those SDRs. So we have some interesting instruments on the table, but when push comes to shove, the basic budgeting capacity and the fiscal solvency is what really will drive and attract some of the financing from around the world. So I just wanted to say a few things here. One is, a very good partnership with Oxford University and the Green Fiscal Policy Network, which includes the IMF, the GIZ, and also other partners. We've looked at the fiscal parameters of spending over time, actually used them with Oxford to look at the Global Recovery Observatory, the $16 to $18 trillion of rescue and recovery spending around the world, for the impacts, the environmental impacts, the climate impacts, the social impacts, the growth impacts of that spending. And by looking at that data set, actually can bring that knowledge to budgeting itself. And I think Brian O'Gallaghan, who's with you, will say a bit more about that. But just essentially, every dollar counts. There is a way of looking at the impacts, not only the social impact, which we've heard today from several ministers, but also the growth impact, the employment impact, and the climate impact of that spending. The one last thing I want to say is that there is a question of fairness here, and my colleague from OECD has spoken to it. Africa accounts for less than 3% of global emissions, but bears the highest and disproportionate share of the impacts. And adaptation costs will be huge in the future. I think the African Development Bank estimates them around $50 billion a year by 2050. And even now we have a climate financing gap. So there is a fairness question here, and I've heard ministers put it on the table. I think we have two legs to stand on. One is the budgeting, which will be so important because it signifies commitment, political commitment, and putting our own houses in order. And then the other is the fairness question, where the world needs to step up and recognize that climate financing is desperately needed in Africa. With that, Chair, I'll hand it back to you and to my colleague Brian, who could perhaps say a few more words about our experience on green budgeting. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much for these insights. Perhaps we can move to Brian to give us more in depth on what you see as the challenges that this sustainable budgeting approach can actually address, and if you could briefly outline that for us.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you, Deputy Executive Secretary Dr. Morsi, and good afternoon, Excellencies on stage and generous colleagues in the audience as well. I think to start with, as Dr. Morsi kind of hinted in her opening, this morning was very much focused on how we access finance, whereas this session is a little bit more focused on how we use finance. I want to start an opening by saying that there's really an inextricable link between those two, and there's a link both in terms of private aid and how that boosts finance, and also public aid, ODA. So on the ODA side, we found that development partners can be exceptionally more interested in supporting nations that are able to show a plan that's aligned with their own internal priorities and a pathway for getting there, and seeing that pathway actually executed year to year. Part of the hesitation comes in when those pathways are not executed for whatever reasons. That's just the first point there. That's why having a systematic approach to budgeting can help on the ODA side. And on the private side, it's very much similar, right? We talk a lot about crowding in private investment. Crowding in doesn't just happen. It has to be a part of a concerted plan and effort to get there. So that's how these two pieces come together. Maybe to share a couple of words on context, but those on stage have really given a lot of that already. Our economies in Africa, I say our, I'm from South Africa originally, although my accent doesn't give that away. Our economies are really in a tough state right now. 43% of countries in Africa are at a high risk of default, according to the IMF. And progress on Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063 really hasn't been as great as we'd like it to be because of external factors, right? And we think there's a real role for a sustainable approach to budgeting in this. And the role is there because we can't afford to waste the very little resources that we have. We need to use it for double benefits, triple benefits, as much as we possibly can. So just on that, the purpose of the sustainable budgeting approach is to find opportunities for spending and taxation that simultaneously boost economic and environmental outcomes. And to do that across every sector. Just to relate back to the generous comments of our respected, the representative from the OECD, this isn't actually about tracking. It's about a lot more than that. As Dr. Morsi mentioned, it's about trade-offs, right? It's one thing to know how much green you're spending. It's another thing entirely to manage the difficult trade-offs of perhaps development outcomes, social outcomes, and those climate outcomes. So what we're really looking for here is a way that we can meet all of those, and that's what a sustainable budgeting approach is trying to help us do. Perhaps we could bring up the survey on the screen. Oh, it's there already. This is a workshop, and we're trying to ensure that it's not just a set of panelists speaking to you. So if you'd like to get out your phones and scan the QR code on the screen, or otherwise you can just type in www.slido.com and then a code is 911 because it's an emergency. And I will try to manage this from my phone as we're speaking. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to get that up. The first question is going to be just who is in the audience today. We'd like to understand the different people we're all speaking with. And then to the second, we'll ask kind of what are the limitations with current approach to budgeting? Why is it difficult to integrate climate priorities? And then after that, kind of what opportunities do we see? So yeah, we encourage you to scan that QR code and get on there. So the first question was this, just we'd like to understand who is represented here today. And I can see lots of phones still up with scanning the QR code, so I'll give it a couple of seconds. And hopefully, oh, there we go. We can see the results live. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this, so please do catch up as we go along, but hopefully we'll see a reasonable spread of different actors here. That's exactly what this workshop is trying to do. And apologies if any of the translations are a little bit off. Okay, so the first real question, we're wondering how are budget decisions made in your country? What are the core pieces that drive decision making? And as you respond there, I'll give you a couple of the insights that we found at the University of Oxford in partnership with our many colleagues to this question. We found that in many cases, there are entirely blank spaces where a planning office might usually sit. So again, when we're talking about having a long-term objective for a nation, a long-term plan, if we don't have a planning office to execute that in our budget offices, how are we going to reach that goal? And again, that's where a sustainable budgeting approach comes in. Okay, we're getting some results, so I might put them up on the screen. Fairly overwhelmingly, it seems like our political priorities are driving this. And this, we're all sovereign countries, so of course political priorities are important, but some of these other priorities need to be a part of the decision-making process at least. And I might move on to the final question for now. Dr. Morsi might bring us back for another a little bit down the track. But we're just wondering, in your own words, what are the barriers that stop climate alignment in your fiscal budgets? And again, to this, the University of Oxford, working with a number of countries, we've kind of identified three broad areas. The first one is there's an outdated conception on the economics of climate investment. And in that one, let me dive a little bit deeper. Back in the early 2000s, it was very clear green investment was super expensive and perhaps something only of very rich, only that very rich nations could tinker in. They were the only ones that had the capacity, the fiscal space to do that. However, 20 years later, the opposite is true. Our research, including studies with the ECA for South Africa, the DRC, Kenya, and Egypt last year, they all showed that in almost every sector, there are green investment opportunities that are equal to or greater than traditional opportunities in terms of how many jobs they create and the economic multiplier effects. So that was the first real finding to this question of what is limiting us. Secondly, we really see a lack of adequate trade-off apparatus, hence sustainable budgeting approach, and then of course there's always a political limitation there too. Okay, we've got a bunch of results. These are all completely anonymous, by the way. I couldn't even find them if I tried, but a couple of them are there on the screen, and hopefully we can share a few a little bit later too. Okay, we can take down the survey for now. So in our work, just to summarize, we've seen that if budgets are not based on the likely development or other outcomes of the policy, it stems from those three areas, right? We don't understand that the economics are actually quite good for this now. We don't have a good trade-off system, and sometimes there are political interferences. So diving into the budgeting approach to address that, now that I've laid out that background, the sustainable budgeting approach as we've conceived it and worked with various partners just to set the base for it, really is an opportunity now to expand it and change it so it best suits countries. But the approach builds on the most advanced academic understanding of the economic and environmental impacts of different policy types. So it takes what is meant to be the absolute leading edge of our understanding, and it simplifies it into the least number of possible inputs to our decision-making processes, because we can't comprehend 1,000 different inputs at once. So that's the broad idea. To do that, it basically simplifies the universe of policy options into 50 categories and 200 subcategories. Every one of those 200 subcategories has been assessed by researchers over a couple of years now for impacts on short and long-term greenhouse gas emissions. But not only that, it's also been assessed for impacts on natural capital impacts, adaptation and resilience impacts, some social indicators as well. And also we've set the framework for economic impacts to come into it. We haven't defined what those economic impacts are because they change so much country to country, and it's essential that a country themselves is involved in that process. Just to state the obvious, right? Burning a ton of coal in Australia is akin to burning a ton of coal in South Africa. It's the same number of GHGs that go into the atmosphere, but a coal job in Australia is very, very different from a coal job in South Africa. And hence the economic side really needs to be led by the countries themselves. And then in the final stage, right, if you have an understanding of all these policy types and their greenhouse gas impact, their natural capital impact, their adaptation resilience impact, and their economic impact, you have the information you need to make an informed decision. And that's the purpose of the SBA, or the Sustainable Budgeting Approach. I'm going to come towards an end here. I want to mention that we have piloted this work in Gabon last year with success, and are in the process of applying it in several other countries, also with great enthusiasm. Mr. Moran, in his description of the Finnish experience, was talking about how arduous and manual this process can be. In that context, we're talking about a process that isn't systematized. It doesn't have a systematic set of assessed policies like we've done here. So the whole point of this is to take out a huge portion of that manual component and make it, repeatable. But of course, we need capacity building in order to make anything of this nature a reality in our countries. And so that's part of the purpose of this session here. What we want to know is, at the upcoming COP and perhaps beyond that, is there an opportunity for Africa to bring forward sustainable budgeting as an area of priority, and in particular, to bring forward the need for capacity building for this kind of work in your nations? And I think I'll leave it there as I pass back to our chair.
Thank you very much. A very interesting insights and results. I think I'd like to perhaps go back to policymakers here to just get their takes or reflections in terms of how they have used the budgeting framework and process in their own countries in terms of to support this issue of managing very difficult trade-offs, short-term versus long-term. How have you, utilized that in practice, and how have you worked to make the process perhaps in a way that supports for you to make very difficult decisions, as well as the issue of using it to catalyze finance. So have the work that you're done on the budgeting front supported actually, donor or international support coming to you, or the relationship with international community? So I'm not sure who would like to perhaps give us some thoughts. Please, go ahead. Kenya?
Well, thank you again, and sincerely appreciate the organization from Egypt for this very interesting discussion. Now, not a lot really, but let me just start from the basics. That starting from the long-term development framework, going down to what we call medium-term planning, and also what we call our budget policy statements. Then that leads to what we call medium-term expenditure framework, and then the annual budget. To the extent that we have pronounced ourselves in terms of what we want to do in the area of sustainable financing, climate change interventions, then we have seen quite a lot of interest in terms of the interactions that we have with the development partners in the design of our development programs. So in a way, there is an indirect benefit where the design of development frameworks, development programs, like for instance, we're talking about in the agricultural sector, where we're talking about drought-resistant seeds and adopting methods of farming that recognize the challenge of climate. That is an area which has benefited from that planning framework, which has recognized the need for us to address climate change and also have a sustainable budgeting, so to speak. Now, in terms of the actual sustainable budgeting, so to speak, I would say we are in the very early stages because we've just started what I did mention earlier on about the budget coding, so that we can be able to track and report what it is we are doing in terms of projects, programs, and also the areas of implementation of activities that have got a climate change component. So we feel, I think progressively we are going to build a good repository of data or information that can be useful as we continue now to go out there and pitch for climate-related financing that we hope we can get at a lower pricing. Because again, the challenge that we have also been seeing is that when you do financing for projects where you say this is green financing, and then initially you are not getting that benefit in terms of lower costs of financing. If anything, it is very, very complicated and expensive to structure a project that qualifies finally for green financing. So again, there's a challenge that we are seeing, but we are willing to hear and get information from the countries that are ahead of us so that we can perfect and improve our game. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else would like to give their insight? Please go ahead. If you can just pass the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you so much once again. Like I indicated at the beginning, we have a whole program dedicated to climate change. And in addition, I mentioned that we do mainstream climate-related issues across all programs of government. Now, what we have done at the level of budgeting, we have introduced an electronic program-based budgeting tool that integrates the interventions we have in the medium-term framework with the annualized budgets through that system. Now, at the time of beginning the budget cycle, we issue what we call budget call circulars to all the ministries, departments, and agencies. And in these budget call circulars, we indicate that one of the key requirements is mainstreaming climate-related issues in the budgets of the various ministries, departments, and agencies of government. So that's actually one of the criteria for accessing resources as one of the measures intended to green the budget. Of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, the only limitation is about the availability of adequate resources. It suffices to mention also that in moving forward on sustainable budgeting, I think development partners need to recognize that in some of these African countries, they are so privileged naturally in terms of the natural resources, in terms of the supply of rain, the climatic conditions. They are all conducive. In fact, the cost of planting or growing a tree in Uganda, for example, could be less than a quarter what you would spend in many other jurisdictions. So a dollar spent on climate interventions in Uganda could generate a lot of benefits as compared to many other countries. So in effect, I'm saying that you have the quick wins in some of these countries. So in looking for where to invest the limited resources that the global community has, they need first to choose countries where they will need minimum investment. In other words, when you plant a tree in Uganda, you may not need to go and irrigate it. You may not need to supply fertilizers to that tree. It will grow naturally on its own, which is not the case in many other countries. You need to be there to constantly supply water to that tree. So really, I think this is a call to the global community to pick these quick wins, especially in trying to address the problem of the pollution that we are experiencing today in many countries. Secondly, I thought that I should emphasize that within our law, we are provided for disasters as a percentage of the budget. We provided 0.5%, but which is very modest. But the disasters that we're experiencing today are far beyond what we are able to provide in the budget. So we end up suppressing other budgets to deal with these disasters because the resource provision was initially not adequate. So we can actually avert these disasters by addressing the current requirements today. The disasters, say, an example, the mudslides on mountainous areas as a result of depletion of forests, our forest cover on top of these mountains. So you end up in a situation where you have mudslides. So these situations could be averted if we did that minimum investment that I'm talking about right now.
Yeah. I am being told that we are running over time, so I'll let
Okay,
you.
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. If you would you like to?
As I said,
briefly,
I think sitting here, I noticed we share same things in terms
Yes.
of how we plan budget. I think that's uniform across Africa. But what I want to say here is that for we in Sierra Leone, we are very committed, as I noted earlier. We have a whole Ministry of Environment, which we are supporting, and also we've made deliberate effort to put a lot of money around the budgeting because we are looking at the green economy. So we are making a lot of effort intervening because if you don't do it, as you noted, the cost of some of these disasters are so high that at the end of the day, you have to look at other sources of funds, how you address those issues. And it's critical, year in, year out, we are seeing the depletion of most of our forests. So I think it's a call. I'm happy that the COP27 is bringing us all together and the essence of us making more efforts. I think by the end of November, most of it, we are now doing a budget. Even coming from here, some of us are going to look at how we direct more resources into those areas in terms of prevention. But definitely, I think there is a need for us to put more money into our budget in protecting the environment.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for a really lively and insightful discussion that we had today in a very topical issue. We look forward on picking up these discussions in the COP27 upcoming meetings. And thank you very much. If you can please give them a round of applause. Thank you.